Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The special board meeting for the Alameda County workshop. For that's our special. Yeah, regarding so first we'll have our roll call. Secretary, please call the roll.
Directors Huang, Sethy,
Here.
Weed, Akbari,
Here.
and Gunther.
Here. This evening, I'll lead the salute to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, the republic which is stands, visible, liberty, and justice for all. Request the general manager to read in some items regarding this evening's meeting.
We'll absolutely do that. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ed Stevenson, and I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this board meeting in person or remotely by either using the Zoom application or by telephone. Any member of the public participating in person may approach the speaker's podium at the appropriate time. For those participating remotely, note that the meeting agenda and all related materials are available on the district's website at acwd.org. You may reference the instructions at the top of the agenda for how to participate using the Zoom controls or your dial pad if participating by telephone audio. This hybrid board meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public for future viewing. And thank you all for attending. And just a quick note to introduce Jackie McLeod, who's our new special assistant to the general manager. And Jackie will wave at you all. It's great to have Jackie on board. She's been here just over a week now. So that means she's fully indoctrinated, hard at work, already engaged in all kinds of different things. We have her working on advancing our strategic planning work, our legislative program, employee engagement issues. And so she's already elbows deep in a lot of things. And she goes by Jackie of all trades, as I mentioned when introducing her in the past, but it's really great to have Jackie on board this evening for the first time. And we'll be seeing a lot more of Jackie as we move forward. So President Gunther, that completes my housekeeping remarks.
Okay, well, item one there, or three, I should say, public comments on matters of this notice of special meeting, water resources planning workshop. Anybody online there? Looks like one of our employees. Mr. Aber.
Well, the water industry in California has consistently had a miserable track record on strategic planning of water for water demand. And in the past, if you look at the graphs, people will always show a little line going up in the future, but they will never show you that do the hindcasting and do the checking of their previous lousy forecasts, where they forecasted going up to the moon and then it actually started going down a little bit or stayed flat, and then they did it again, and then they did it again, and then they did it again. And of course, it starts from a lower baseline because the demand was dropping while they were increasing their forecasts. And then, so nobody ever goes back and does that. And then in the future, they rarely go back do the per capita demand, which is also going down in California. And now in the future, people are probably estimating to stay flattish per capita, but nationwide, it's forecast to go down 1% per year per capita. And then another thing they don't do is when they do per capita, they show these unrealistic population growth forecasts. Everybody says, oh, we're planning for population growth. I've seen some county agencies do that. We're planning for population growth, it looks whatever it is, a little growth. And in fact, the population was dropping a few tenths of a % per year over the last couple of years. And in the future, You know, the state forecast, sometimes the Metropolitan Water District, they even forecast based on per capita growth, but the state was forecasting a certain number for the growth, and they forecast a bigger number for growth over the next 20 years, even though, you know, where did they get that number? Anyway, so please be careful, and if we don't see some flattish water demand or maybe even dropping, and I'm really hoping not to hear about the state is restricting us and keeping us from having the natural demand. We're getting restricted because the natural demand isn't growing. It's been flattish or dropping, and the state isn't really restricting us because the market, the consumer demand is restricting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haber. Further comments? Seeing none, we'll open up our action calendar to.
Yeah, it's a board workshop this evening, but we do have one action calendar item for you this evening. This is item 4.1, authorization of agreement for operator temporary staffing services. And I'll ask Mr. Wunderlich to address this item.
Great, thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Good afternoon, members of the board and public. And so what this contract is that's in front of you today is pertains to a specialized technical staffing agency that would allow us to utilize certified operators. So the district has a number of contracts for different types of temp staffing, but they generally don't relate to this type of highly specialized need. And with the new PFAS system online, we are expecting a temporary increase in workload, as well as this being available to address any long-term staff illness or industrial injury or other type of situation in the future. And so it is proposed that the district enter into a single source agreement with Operational Technical Services LLC, provider specializing in these services. And approval of this item will help meet strategic plan goal 1, maintain and improve the cost effectiveness and value of district services. And the recommendation is by motion, authorize the general manager to 1, enter into an agreement for specialized temporary staffing services with Operational Technical Services for a base term of 2 years for a cost not to exceed $200,000, and 2, exercise up to 3 one-year option terms if the services are satisfactory to the district, for a potential total contract term of 5 years and for a total not to exceed amount of $500,000. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I don't have any questions, public comments. Okay, we have a recommendation. Do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion to adopt staff recommendation.
Motion, do we have a second? We have a second. Secretary, please call the roll.
Directors Huang, Sethy,
Yes.
Weed, Akbari,
Aye.
and Gunther.
Aye. Are we expecting Director Wong this evening?
No, Director Wong is traveling right now. So
Okay,
this is our board this evening.
thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so item 5 then on the agenda. This is our marquee item this evening. This is our water resources planning workshop, and this is the second in a series of workshops planned for this year and for next calendar year that'll be focusing on planning for long-term management of the district's water resources in the face of climate change, evolving regulations, declining availability of water supplies, new water supply alternatives, and other factors using an integrated resources planning approach. This workshop series builds on previous workshops conducted in 2022 and 2023. And as the board knows, we are now entering phase 2 of this water resources master planning process. And what the board has heard thus far is phase 2 is where some real heavy lifting happens. And so our heavy lifting will start tonight. The heavy lifting is going to be done by both staff, our consultants, but also the board too. So we'll be looking for input from the board this evening, and we know you guys are ready to offer it. So beyond that, I will turn it over to our Director of Water Resources, Ms. Heides.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. The team is very excited to be here today to kick off phase 2 You're going to hear from staff and from our consultants and hear about water demands and what we have in store for our phase 2. But what we really want to do is hear from you, as Mr. Stevenson mentioned today as well. So we look forward to diving in. So I'm just going to turn it directly over to Mr. Thomas Nizer, our Water Supply and Planning Manager, to get us started and introduce the team.
And actually, just before we get started, just a quick note. I was chatting with a member of the public before the meeting. We're very acronym heavy in our industry. And of course, in this presentation, if we can recognize when we're using acronyms and kind of spell them out, that would be helpful to folks attending.
I'll do that ASAP.
Hey, okay.
All right, well, thank you. As mentioned, this is the kickoff of phase 2 of the Water Resources Master Plan. This is the first of 5 scheduled board workshops specific for development of that master plan. Here with us tonight is the new consultant team for phase 2. You may recognize them. They were also awarded for phase 1. From Woodard and Kern, I'd like to introduce Persephone St. Charles. You have myself, Philippe Daniel of Laquisti Subcontract, and Katie Cole from Woodard and Kern. Also here tonight presenting will be Tanzi, myself, and then we also have some other team members here. Ethan Birch is a member of the WRMP team. Stephanie Nevins, who's online, and team adjacent is Michelle Walden is also here. So title tonight, Focusing the Water Resources Master Plan. The purpose for this first step was to really solidify the findings and conclusions from phase 1 and to formalize them for the project work for phase 2. But as the board heard last month, I believe it was last month, we did a presentation on the results of the new water use efficiency regulations from the state of California, and we took great pains to go through those measures with the board and to reflect on what those meant for our long-range water demand forecasting. I will briefly retouch on the regs for the benefit of the audience here tonight. As we shared last month, the significance is that these are substantial reductions in long-term demand for the water district, and that's the first step of any planning process. So they are significant, and we want to take some time tonight to show, repeat what the demand forecast looks like, but also to take some time to show what some of that means in application. Last month, we just looked at the demands, but having reduced demands obviously has some significant effects on how we're going to do our business moving forward. So we wanted to make sure we take some time and also to reflect on the significance of these new regs before commencing with the core structure of the Water Resources Master Plan. And then we want to engage in some meaningful conversation. The general manager and Ms. Heides and myself, we met with Director Wong ahead of time to review the slides. We did get some comments and questions from her. I'm going to interject those during the evening, so we have the benefit of her voice here. Obviously, we're also missing another director, and I think we're going to discuss how we will maybe do some recapping of the entire board at a near-term future date, because this is under the direction of the board. We want to make sure that the balance of the discussion is held together. Acknowledge that this is a case where if we were to piecemeal comments and input from each of you, the sum of those parts would definitely be smaller than what it would be if you were all here having that discussion together and feeding off of each other and responding to each other in real time. So with that, I would like to introduce Stephanie up.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back and see all of you again. We've come a long way since the last time I was here. As you see on this little pathway here, the markings in teal show the phase 1 work that we completed leading up to where we are today in October 2024. As some of you might remember, a lot of the work that we did in phase 1 was really about formulating goals. Water resources goals, how do we see our future and how do we want our water resources to look in that future? How objectives for that planning, how we're going to conduct this planning effort, what do we want to try to get out of that? And we also spent some good time talking about evaluation criteria of how we would look at what are the values that are important so that we can assess whether the strategies that we're proposing, how well those are going to perform against those values. And of course, those are tightly correlated to the goals. So that was the work that we did in phase one. It resulted in a phase two scope. That was then the order and the work for us that we've already started to embark on now here in phase two. So we've used a lot of that work in phase one, and that's really informed how we are and where we are today. And as Mr. Neiser mentioned, he's informed us and the consultant team about the discussions that you had at your September 12th board meeting on the urban water use objectives. And so we really wanted to understand your decision on adopting those. How is that going to affect our planning moving forward? We had that scoped already. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about how we're going to be conducting phase two, making sure that we have that lens as part of our exploration together. So this is our work plan for phase two. We had a similar one for phase one, and you can see where we are up at the top there, 2024 in October. The first band here is showing the different outreach points. So again, we're proposing to have board workshops with all of you. We're going to have advisory workshops with interested parties, that some of which had participated in phase one. And then of course, extended team workshops with staff here at ACWD. So our process now, you can see it begins with really understanding baseline demand and baseline supplies and future condition scenarios. That's the zone that we're in. So the topic today is very pertinent to where we are in this planning process. How do those adoption of those urban water use objectives impact how we look at baseline supply and demand, and then how we also look at what the future conditions will be that we want to assess and that we want to assume as part of this planning process. And then you'll see after at the bottom of the planning process, we're bringing up the phase one goals and objectives. Those are ones that we're carrying over from our phase one process to guide us and inform us. But today we want to make sure that those still make sense and that we are confirming that those are still the goals and objectives that you all want to use moving forward. So we're going to talk about that today, but that gives you a sense of where we are in this process. So our agenda is very much aligned with the objectives that have already been presented. There's going to be discussion about the resiliency with a look at what the UWUO is. And in this case, the acronym is spelled out. It's Urban Water Use Objectives. How does that impact how we look at resiliency through this planning effort? I'll come back and talk a little bit, remind you all of the goals and objectives and the criteria that we brought forward from phase one, and talk a little bit about how we might look at those for phase two, given this new major assumption in future. And then Mr. Danielle is going to end us with a discussion to get your feedback and input. Now, throughout these first two pieces, feel free to ask clarifying questions about the material, but just note that at the end is when we're really looking to have a facilitated discussion to get all of your feedback and input, what you've heard, all of the material that we're presenting today. So with that.
Okay. So as mentioned, we want to recap from last board meeting for the benefit of the public, persons online, or for posterity, anyone watching this video later, so they understand what we're talking about. Mentioned we have the urban water use objectives. We have an acronym, but we actually refer to these as the objectives. So published, finalized after multiple years of, after multiple years of preparation, the state has finalized efficiency standards for the public. We had anticipated these ahead of starting our resources master plan update. They were a bit delayed, and so that's why they've sort of, clumsily showed up, about 2 months ago in the middle of this process. We'd hoped to have these things firmed up earlier on, and that's why we're making such a big deal about these things. So I apologize for the timing. It wasn't my fault. Before we get in the objectives, though, we want to just do a quick walk through sort of memory lane. There's one common theme that we have tonight, and as was hinted at from a member of the public, is every 5 years, when this district has updated its urban water management plan, there's one thing that's true, is that we have projected falling future demands. This chart before you here is actually reflecting for each of the years that this agency has published an urban water management plan, which is done every 5 years, starting in 1995. Our forecast demand at true, what we call true build out, which is this hypothetical future where the entire service district is fully developed for the plans for the region, as depicted in those blue line, the blue bars on that chart here. Those numbers have just dropped continuously. We're always assuming that build out happens 25 years into the future. That's just sort of consistent with California planning codes. And so if you look at that trend there, you can see we put a little trend line on there. That blue line has dropped at a pretty even clip every 5 years since 1995. A couple of things I'd point out is that, and actually I should say first, almost in response to the comment from the public earlier, water agencies have to be a little bit on the conservative side. We can't be optimistic about the demand for water in the future because you can't just develop a water supply overnight. So there's always a degree of conservatism that has to be factored in there. We expect the forecast to be a little bit on the high side. And the trick is to get it in a range that makes sure we don't overcommit or overinvest in new supplies to meet an unrealistic future goal. So they are expected to be on the high side. One thing I'll point out is that certainly since 2005, there's been no change in the level of build out of this service area. We are seeing a lot of folks point out that we're seeing a lot of high density development now, which we refer to as smart growth, transit oriented development. That's been in the works for over 20 years now. It's anticipated, it's been built into our forecasting. And every 5 years, these numbers still come out to the same, what we call carrying capacity, a population target for this region that's based on housing, as well as the number of jobs supported by the commercial and industrial building area for the region. So while those demand projections have dropped steadily, there's been no change since 2005 in the expected level of build out of the land that would be driving the demand for water. So pre-reflected on here is the projection for the 2025 plan right now. So that's the current build out. That's what the board saw last month. If you notice, it's really not far off from that dashed line. So the point there is, while we are looking at some state regulations, the objectives, we're not talking about a huge departure from where we've seen the natural decay of demand for water going anyway. And that, for me personally, was very comforting, largely because I produced these numbers for the past 20 years. But to see that trend pop out from a totally different mechanism is very comforting. So with that, a refresher of what the objectives are. What these are new regulatory efficiency standards that have been established by the state, and they're used for calculating a water agency's unique objective, urban water use objective, and that's based on population and the end uses of water, residential, commercial, industrial, institutional uses of water. The objective is a sum of the budgets for all of these various built out levels of water demand within our service district. ACWD is responsible to achieve the collective level of use, that efficiency standard. So it's not put on each individual customer. There are financial penalties and consequences if ACWD collectively is not meeting the target, but those are on us, they're not on the end user, right? So if a homeowner on J Street is using 10 times more water than would be efficient, that person is not going to get a special bill from the state of California. And similarly, if the rest of our customers are suppressing their demand and being efficient such that those customers who are not, that we collectively remain below the target, ACWD will not be fined by the state of California. One key thing about the regulations are they are ratcheting down. So every 5 years, roughly, they're becoming stricter and stricter. So it's giving us time to implement these measures, as you'll see depicted in the next chart.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Sure.
So can you define for everyone's benefit here, what a water loss budget is? Is that the natural water loss through the distribution system? Does it apply toward a particular customer base?
So more or less, I can't get into the details because I don't have the full details at my fingertips, but it collectively is a combination of water that is used for things that don't get metered. For example, when there's a fire and the fire department hooks up to hydrants, there's no meter on there. Nobody's taken the time to say, don't put that fire out yet. We need to get a meter on here, right? So that sort of water is accepted losses of water. So we have combinations of accepted known losses of water. And then there is just an accepted level of actual lost water. No water pipe network is 100% bulletproof, has no leaks in it. To build such a system would be a phenomenal cost that this community could not possibly pay for. So there's an efficiency level of our system with an accepted level of physical losses of water. And those are pretty much the main categories.
Got it.
Okay. And there's a lot of minutia within there still. So first to look back, where have we been? This chart first depicts the level of demand that we've seen, our annual demand, which we reflect as millions of gallons per day on average. And since 2005, you can see it has basically steadily dropped. It's had some ups and downs to reflect wet and dry periods and droughts, but we've seen a year over year pretty rapid decline of the demand for water. And using our historic practices, sort of best practices for projecting out the demand for future water. Traditionally, we would be looking at a line like this dash blue line here. So this is the product of a traditional best industry practices for projecting water demand. And in light of there being no regulations, this is exactly what we would be recommending to use for the Urban Water Management Plan, which is our public document to document all of our water supplies and our planning. And we would be using it as the basis for this planning effort, our master plan update. But as I've mentioned, we have these new regulatory standards that are going to force us to ensure that the community achieves a level of efficiency. I should pause first. For the public, we refer to this little uptick in the last 5 years as the hockey stick. And what that is a reflection of, as the member of the public earlier, Mr. Abreu, mentioned, we get given very big population growth projections to use as the basis of our forecasting. They come from the city, they come from the regional governance, the Association of Bay Area Government. And we find those population projections, as was noted by Mr. Abreu, tend to be pretty aggressive. And so we take a projection based on what we think is a more realistic growth rate, albeit a little high even, because we want to be a little bit conservative. And we take everything that's unexplained over the next sort of 20 years or so, and we put it in that last 5 years. And the reason we do that is we want to be able to be accountable for the potential demand for water in the service district without moving it too soon in and actually building supplies and infrastructure needed to provide for a future demand that may not materialize, or certainly not within a reasonable time frame. So this allows us to document it in our urban plan. We will publish our reliability with that so that the public knows what future growth will mean for water supply reliability, as well as to say that we are looking at it and aware that the potential is there. But really, this first 20 years on this line is really where we think is a much more realistic growth rate. So I'd like to move on. If we overlay these new regulatory standards, you can think of them as being a limit. And they're depicted by this red line here. And as you notice, right around the year 2035, we see that red line drop below the blue line. So what does this mean? Sorry, I'm using the laser for the members of the public. Maybe I'll go here. Makes the microphone a little more challenging. So here we're saying from the current year, 2024, out to the year 2035, you'll see the blue line being below the red line, which is a regulatory target. We're below that red line. So we're in compliance with the state regulations. But as these become stricter over time, we mentioned the regulations are getting stricter, they get ratcheted down. This red line is coming down. So this is a target that's reflecting our projected population growth. This red line gets tighter and tighter, and we see around the year 2035, we are looking to be in excess of the regulatory targets by quite a bit, a couple million gallons per day. As this board discussed and has previously shared, the intention of ACWD is to comply with the regulation. And this board confirmed last month its unanimous commitment to make sure that happens. So that means we need to be investing in water conservation in our community to get their efficiency down. It also means that this red line becomes our de facto demand forecast. We know that we are going to be not higher than this red line if we are in compliance with the rules, which the board has said it will ensure that we are with the appropriate investments. So what we wind up, I'm
Thomas,
sorry.
can I ask a quick question? So starting in 2040, it looks like the objectives kind of lighten up a little bit and the curve starts to go up.
Correct.
And that's well before even our hockey stick growth that we anticipate.
Correct.
Can you just explain why in 2040 our objectives seem to get a little bit
Change direction?
change direction?
Sure.
right?
2040 is the last year of the ratcheting down. So at that point, we are just looking at the efficiency expectation of our existing customers, and now it starts growing because in that background is that growth. So that red line, if we were to sort of take away the effect of growth, it would actually be a much steeper line. It's getting the benefit of growth because new growth is actually highly efficient. As we know, the plumbing codes are very efficient and the per capita water demand is quite a bit lower than our existing customer base. So there's some funky math going on in the background there, but that's basically it. The restrictions become final in 2040. Okay. So as mentioned, that red line is becoming a sort of de facto forecast. And while that doesn't come into effect until 2035, there is a lot of conservation to be implemented to make that happen. So right now we've sort of put this chart together sort of to depict the near term. We're below the target. We think demand may be coming back still a little bit from recent droughts. It may not be. We've certainly had some hot weather this summer. We have seen a lot of customer response to that hot weather, more than I had hoped to see, because we'd seen that flatten out quite a bit during the drought period. But customers are still very responsive to warm weather. Those are climate change factors. There's a lot that's going to go on in here. So we think over the next 10 years, we have this nice sort of envelope, this little shaded green area to say where our demand forecast is going to be roughly somewhere in here. But come 2035, we need to be moving heaven and earth to get the conservation and efficiency standards such that we are on this line. And that is the basis of the demand forecast that we will be using for the planning. One thing I'd like to take a moment to point out about this is that there's this big range of uncertainty out here, right? Whether we hit the regulatory standards or not. And we had some discussion last month of what if we can't make the conservation happen? The one good thing about that is if you take that peak demand along with that blue line at the end of that hockey stick, which we think is not going to be happening in 25 years' time, and you drop back to where we've been, it's well below our recent history. So that means we know what it takes to meet that level of 42 million gallons per day. We know what production capacity, what pipe sizes are needed. We know what supplies are needed. It's traveled territory. And that's a very comforting thing for us to work on. If we fall on the wrong side of our projection on the high side, we know we've got the reliability to meet that. As opposed to in 1995 when the original IRP was passed. If we were off and we were several MGD higher in our long term, that would directly result in some real problems that hadn't been analyzed. So it's a good place to be as far as comfort that we'll have the reliability and we know what it takes to meet that should we fail to meet our goals, which we won't. We won't. Any questions on that, Director Gunther? You look like you're stewing on something there. Okay. So with that, this is what we call the gloom and doom demand forecast that we presented last month. We do want to show you some of the upsides of high water use efficiency. And with that, I'm going to invite Dr. Tanzi up here to do some modeling, but I want to just give a quick introduction first of the topic. What you're going to see now are model results of what would be our traditional modeling, standard reliability modeling that we would do for our urban water management plan for a study like this. We're going to look at the results with and without the water demand regulations in place. I'll introduce the two scenarios. One is the DSS demand. Apologize for these acronyms. They're not even good acronyms in this case. That's Decision Support System. That would be our traditional forecasting methodology. And then we have the regulatory demand forecast. The list of assumptions in here are really here just to let you know that there's a lot of thought that goes into this modeling. We're not going to walk through all the details in here, but some of the things to point out are the assumptions about the future water supply reliability. For example, we have the mid-century state water project modeling. This is what's going to be used for the urban water management plan preparation. It reflects mid-century sea level rise, climate change. We have San Francisco's reduced water supply availability, assuming the Bay Delta quality plan regulations are in effect. So we're just sort of documenting what is and is not assumed in here. The takeaway is there's really nothing too significant in here other than to let you know we are looking at the future reduced demands. I will note at this point that Director Wong pointed out that there's no assumptions about desalination on here, and that's simply because there's no change in the assumption from today. There's no plans on the books to do anything differently with desalination, and that's why it's not listed here. And that's going to be true for just about anything you see not listed on here. Director Sethy.
So thinking about where the state has been heading on these new regulations over the last couple of years, I do have something to stew about. Which is that the goal of the state, as best I can ascertain, is to help save state water supplies that come imported from Northern California. And we have a groundwater basin, which represents 40% of our water supply that comes from the watershed. And so I look at that as opportunistic water to sell outside of the state guidelines. That if we are, and you don't have to answer my question right now, throwing it out there for thought, that if we are in compliance with reduction of water from state water project, I can see that as an admirable goal. But what comes from our own watershed, I feel like is within our jurisdiction to do with as we wish.
Noted. I don't hear a question in there. It's just a comment. Comment noted sounds like the continued interest in exploring water markets in the future. If I could paraphrase.
Well, there is a question here, which is, how are we factoring and applying the urban water usage objectives? Is it just imported water? Is it all of our water?
Yeah. I would venture to correct your first part of your statement. The regulations are not solely about the state water project. The regulations are really about getting back into alignment with overallocated water resources. As we know, as we've heard a lot during the drought, just about every river system in California has been overallocated as far as issuance of water rights. So it's mostly about getting efficiency standards in place. We're having in-stream flow requirements, and then also it's getting us ready for climate change. So it's applying to the entire state. Now, they apply to our whole system. They're not going to look at just how we use the state. It is how much water are you using? We don't care where it comes from unless it's recycled water. That's got its own category. So as far as the state's concerned, they're agnostic, whether it's state water, groundwater, San Francisco water.
I have issues with that.
Okay.
Put it that simply.
Okay. So with that, Sam.
Thank you, Ms. Snyder. Good afternoon, Board of Directors and member of public. So we would like to take this opportunity to show some of our preliminary modeling results comparing the two different levels of demand. And we are mainly looking at the two major aspects. One is our system level of service reliability, and the other one is beneficial on the cost side. So for the level of the service reliability, we are mainly looking at the three different points. One is looking at our shortages, and then the other one is health of our groundwater basin and our dry year water supply semi-tropic storage. So with that, to get rid of the acronym, and also I have a difficulty pronouncing a word with more than 3 syllables. So that's a reason I have a really short name. So I will call this urban water use objective demand our target demand. And the DSS demand, I call it a higher demand scenario. So first, let's look at the shortages on our 94 years simulated planning hydrology. With this chart, we have the red dashed line there at the 10%. So not to identify the board policy about our shortages, which is greater than 10% of the shortage in 1 of every 30 years is unacceptable. So just comparing those two scenarios with our current target demand scenario, the maximum shortage we have across the 94 years is 6.6%. 6.6% of our annual demand, so which shows really a high level of service reliability. Next, we want to look at the BHF below Hayward-4 groundwater level. So this is a really busy chart. It shows the 94 years of the groundwater level dynamics across the 2 different scenarios. Just in case you haven't realized yet, so we flipped the color of the 2 scenarios. So for now, the orange one is our target demand scenario, and the blue one is the higher demand. This is just a quick check to see if you are still with us. This is a really busy chart. So what we hope you focus on is dry years when the below Hayward-4 groundwater level is low. So we can see for the first multi-year drought event between 1929 to 1934, our target demand scenario still, the groundwater level will still hit the drawdown limit, which identified as a red dashed line there, which is our drawdown limit of the below Hayward-4 groundwater level based on our board policy. Also, it was codified in our SIGMA document. And we will see the first multi-year drought event with a lower target demand, we will still hit the target. But moving on for the next few dry periods, like 1962 and the other multi-year drought event from 1988 to 1994, we will see the groundwater level in the target demand scenario are much better, which is about 2 to 5 feet higher than the higher demand scenario. And if we zoom into the first multi-year drought event, even though with the target demand scenario, the groundwater level still hit the limit, but over 50% of time, the below Hayward-4 groundwater level are still higher than the higher demand scenario, which is our precious dry year water supply during that period. And also with this better performance of the groundwater level, we have reduced our shortages for the first multi-year drought significantly. And next, we want to focus on another critical dry year supply for the semi-tropic storage. Before we do the comparison, let me explain the green dashed line there. This is our stated semi-tropic conjunctive use target as 100,000 acre feet. So when the semi-tropic storage is below that target, we will use semi-tropic water as our dry year supply. If the storage goes above that line, we can use semi-tropic water for both dry year supply and also optimize our operation. So the reason we set this target as 100,000 acre feet, I would like to invite you to look at the first few years of this chart. So we enter in the first multi-year drought event at about 120,000 acre feet. And to the lowest point, if we look at the orange line, the lowest point during the multi-year drought is touched the 20,000 acre feet, which means we will need about 100,000 acre feet of semi-tropic storage to help us to maintain the level of service during the multi-year drought. So,
Sorry to interrupt. I would like to note something here. Just so we can focus on it later. But our contract with Semi-Tropic expires in 2034. And that's just about the crossover year of 2035. And I know Director Weed shares this concern with me that going forward beyond 2034, Semi-Tropic may not be a viable storage or water storage banking opportunity for us because of all the Sigma implementation rules that are going on down in the southern portion of San Joaquin Valley. And it kind of worries me that one of the issues that we need to look at is if it goes away, what are our options? Can we do water banking further up in northern part of the valley? Are there water supplies that could be a substitute? So we should have, in my opinion, a contingency plan if Semi-Tropic is no longer viable.
thank you, Director Sethy. So let's get back to
Do you want
the,
to reply to that?
I'll just
I-
note it up here.
Okay.
So right now we're showing the preliminary modeling results. So with this unchanged semi-tropic storage, but that will be something to consider for the following modeling work. So get back to this 100,000 acre feet DAF target. So we see this usage of the semi-tropic water during the multi-year drought event. So we feel setting this target will give us more confidence entering a multi-year drought with 100,000 acre feet water stored in the groundwater bank. So in other words, when the semi-tropic storage drops below that target, we will give a higher priority to recharge the groundwater bank to bring that storage back to the 100,000 acre feet. Okay, so that's a little bit background about this green dashed line there. So let's look at the comparison of those two scenarios. With the target demand scenario, we see a much better semi-tropic storage. Basically, after 1970, we see the semi-tropic storage basically are always above 100,000 acre feet. And the water above that target, we can use that water to optimize our operations, which will reflect in our cost of annual cost. So with that, note about the difference between before and after 1970. Let's look at the San Francisco water usage here. So before 1970, we prioritize to store more water in semi-tropic, and that's why we have a higher use of San Francisco water. But once we have a healthy storage and a semi-tropic, we can use that water to optimize operation, which gave us a really big potential to on the cost saving part to reduce purchase of the San Francisco water. So if we look at the years after 1970, we see huge benefit of less purchase of the San Francisco water, which saves us a lot of money. And the single year average saving we pointed here could be over 7 million a year, but that's not the key point here. The really point we want to convey here is the sentence above the green arrow. So with careful management of the semi-tropic storage, we could minimize our San Francisco water purchase, which is on the optimization of our operational side, it will give us a lot of benefit.
Just to note, we didn't engage with semi-tropic until sometime in the early 2000s.
Right, this is our planning hydrology. So we use historical hydrology conditions to simulate our existing system, just to see, give us a different hydraulic condition, see how our current system behave. So this is the last slide about the modeling results. So we have this point we want to convey here, and just to extend this point a little bit further, with a summary of what we've seen from the preliminary modeling results. So with the careful management of our current different water supply resources, under this target demand scenario, we see a higher reliability of our level of service, healthier groundwater basin, and better semi-tropic storage, and the potential to have a larger benefit of cost saving. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Snyder.
Thank you, Tan. So what's the point of all this? Last month we went through the regulations and what it means for meeting demands, and bemoaning the amount of work we have to do and the investments we have in conservation. And the truth is, as you'll see in that second bullet, right now we don't know what exactly it's going to take to meet those conservation targets. We know by our traditional practices that the additional conservation, the total conservation program, we're looking at potentially exceeding $5 million per year. We're currently about 1.5. So, a tripling plus. So that's a lot of money, but as we also just heard, in the future, with the full build out demand, we have a tremendous potential to optimize because of our diversified portfolio and potentially be saving more money than what the conservation program is costing us. As what we've known from conservation for the past 30 years, which is that conservation is typically cheaper than alternative water supplies. It's actually, if you think about it, not really too surprising. I'd also put it in some context. We recently stepped away from the Los Vaqueros project. We were looking at spending between $4 and $6 million per year for that project. That came with storage and some other intangible benefits, but was only going to yield at its highest estimate about 1.6 thousand acre feet per year. For $5 million, we're talking about getting 2.6 thousand acre feet per year of conservation. So it gives some perspective of what we're talking about here. But I'm jumping ahead. The first bullet here, the regulations, they clearly provide some benefits to us in terms of giving us clarity. Okay, we're not having to make projections about how much to invest in conservation. We've firmed up what our future demand for water is going to be by an adherence to compliance with this efficiency standards. So they've given us clarity, and they're also giving us the benefit of runway. Tan just shared modeling that's 25 years into the future, assuming that hockey stick. We see in the next couple decades, we're exceeding our level of service goals for critical droughts. We're not even hitting a 10% shortfall. Mind you, we have demand hardening. That 10% cutback is going to get harder for our customers, but we're exceeding our previously set level of service goal. And by doing that, while we are seeing declines in the assumed availability of water supply coming from the state, and climate change impacts are going to be studied quite heavily in this report, we have runway before we need to make a new investment in water supply, as is evident from the data that we've looked at here tonight. That ability to reduce our future dependence on the SFPUC is also adding to flexibility as if we do want to be exploring water markets and other ways to optimize our supplies, both with us, but also in the broader community through things like the BAR and the SWAP program. So we see improved reliability during droughts, and by using our traditional modeling techniques, suggest we're not in a desperate need to develop a new water supply. One other thing I'd point out is during those critical droughts, as the modeling shows, we're frequently several feet higher in the groundwater basin. As this board recently went through some pretty critical droughts and we got pretty low in the basin, We know every extra foot of water, that's the bird in hand, every extra foot of water in that basin is extremely valuable. So there's these other intangible benefits that we're seeing from the modeling.
I'd like to note one other thing here, that we just recently talked about the fact that as a board, I think we unanimously agreed on this, we don't want to degrade our water quality. So SFPUC purchases are not only for meeting our supply needs, but for providing balanced hardness in our water, suppressing the hardness down. So there are those benefits that we need to take into account too. It just can't simply be, oh, we cut SFPUC by half and everything's hunky-dory.
I think what you're implying is that perhaps we're compromising on water quality. This is meeting the existing standard of 150 ppm. This is bound by meeting the blended water quality target that you just mentioned. So in the future, without this demand reduction, we would need to be purchasing full San Francisco to get to that 150 plus to use the wet water. So it's got water quality, it's got a production component, and then it's just water supply. Both of those models have the same performance of 150 parts per million out of blending.
Even with the reduction in
Yes, sir.
purchases?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right,
those are
just wanna make
voluntary
sure.
reductions in purchases. We are meeting the 150 blend goal. The difference is simply we don't need the wet water because we don't need to be filling semi-tropic basin. That
Yeah.
was the significance of our semi-tropic program. Yeah, the scenario, and we saw this a lot with Los Vaqueros. I might need to step back. The future scenario with declining state supply reliability has us buying San Francisco through our direct takeoffs. We need to displace demand on the state water by using San Francisco water and sending the state water down to semi-tropic so that we can have it in a drought. Our San Francisco supply is use it or lose it every contract year. If we leave half of it behind because we feel we don't need it, it's lost. If we use all that water and we displace demand on state water, that state water can be carried over in semi-tropic long-term to get us through to that next drought. And that was the significance of the charts that Tan was showing about the semi-tropic storage and then our ability to optimize on San Francisco purchase.
But we have a minimum purchase
Correct,
agreement.
right. And you'll notice right here where it flattens out, that number is 8,615 acre feet per year. That's years where we are at our minimum. You see it carries over here. Almost look like mesas. That's that minimum purchase. These little dips, you may ask, why are we going below? Those are actual critical droughts where San Francisco is at a deficit and they forego the minimum purchase because they don't actually have enough to give us. So that's exactly what those lines are. If you look at the blue, we never hit those. We can never minimize a purchase objectively in a normal water year. And that was the basis of how we were going to fund Los Vaqueros, was the same dynamic. By having more water that we could store from the state and getting new water supply, we would be able to offset that exact same dynamic there. So,
Thomas, I have a question as
Yes, sir.
well. And I don't know if we want to get into this in detail today or if we want to sit with this question, but when we talk about water use efficiency, a lot of what I understood we did over the last few years was kind of tackle the low-hanging fruit and really focus on getting our customers to build conservation as a part of their daily lives. When we talk about increasing investment into water use efficiency, what's kind of the change of focus that will help us still get that return that we're looking for, and where are we finding those areas where water could be saved today, and we haven't built in conservation already?
it's a great question. And this is a place where the district's been too progressive over the years and too clever. So we have invested primarily since 1995 in outdoor water use. And the reason there is it was biggest bang for buck. So removing turf grass, planting drought tolerance. Not only do we save water, but by shaving off that peak demand, it actually reduces our need for peaking facilities. So we felt that that was the best place to spend our money, and we've been very effective at it. What we're seeing in the regs is that we actually are more or less meeting the outdoor residential water use efficiency, But where we haven't been investing enough has been indoor. For example, for a number of years, we did exemptions from doing toilet replacements, funding toilet replacements, which were best practice. I did many economic analyses over the years to show that we were going to get that benefit with time and that we didn't want to fund those sorts of conservation programs. We wanted to go for that bigger bang for buck. So right now we see that's really where we have a lot of ground to make up is on the indoor use. Our customers' indoor use is not really nearly as efficient as it needs to be. And that's the more expensive stuff. It's the more tedious stuff as well. It's one toilet at a time. So I did want to have a couple comments from Director Wong. Just want to share. She did observe, she reviewed the slides ahead of time as you did, and she came straight out the gate saying, clearly we're going to have to invest more in water use efficiency. I said, okay, well, we put the information together clearly enough. But she also did note that while noting the comment that based on our current, our traditional planning methodology, there's no near-term sign that we need a new water supply. She did emphasize we need to have that next source of supply queued up. We need to know what it will be if and when we need it. And that's certainly true, and it's not lost on this team, that's for sure. Okay. So with that, if there's no further questions on modeling.
All right. So the good news is we know a lot heading into phase 2 already. It's very rare that you can come in and know what your demand line is going to be, and we're not even in an envelope place. I think that tells us a lot. It is going to help focus our planning as we head into phase 2. Also, the good news is that you're in pretty good shape, right? A lot of the work that you've done leading up to today, whether it's, building off of the work that you did in 1995 on the latest IRP, some of the choices that you've made along the way, you're in a pretty good shape right now to have a lot of control over the next near term of how you want to supply to meet your demands, but also you have now, an area that you can focus on for demand management, right? So to that point, there's definitely things that can be done. So we could have looked at this and said, well, we don't need any more supplies. All we needed is a conservation master plan and we'll be good. But I want to also share with you all the goals that you looked at when we talked about what do we view as our water resources future? And we heard from you as directors, but remember, we also heard from the public. We also heard from interested parties that could be potential partners or adjacent agencies that are operating and benefiting from the work that you're doing. They're either impacted by or can impact the work that you're doing. And you came up with these set of goals that if you look at them, what we've been really talking about is really number one here. When we're talking about, sustainable water supply portfolio that leverages local resources and adapts to climate change. And that's the other lens we need to put on this as we head into our planning process, is how are we accommodating climate change? Questions about the viability of supplies that you're currently using, or sources or operational structures that you're currently using. Those are things that that we can investigate as part of this process. So the good news is these goals are pretty wide ranging. They cover a lot of ground that goes beyond just supply equaling demand. As you pointed out, affordable and equitable supply for all direct and indirect customers. So the water quality that everyone is receiving throughout your service area, that's going to be still a part of what we're going to want to make sure that we're achieving. Resilient and optimized water service infrastructure system and operation. So I think, we'll probably have some more space now to get in some of the operational aspects of it. How are your current supplies being optimized? How are they operating? What about storage? All of those types of things. Healthy watersheds and aquifers that are managed to provide multiple benefits. So as you might remember, one of the things that we talked about is we wanted to come up with strategies as part of this that wouldn't just be focused on generating supply, but are also there to enhance healthy watersheds and be good stewards of the aquifers and resources that you share with your community. And then finally, of course, collaborative leadership to facilitate regional water management. So all of these goals are still on the table, and I found it very happy making when we re-looked at these relative to the lens of needing to meet the water use objectives, that these all are still fairly applicable, right? They all still make sense. They all still give us our vision of what we need to do in this planning effort. And so part of what our assignment here today is that's, you know, our opinion, but just confirming with all of you that these do still resonate with you and these do make sense. These are the guidance that we need as we head into phase 2 planning. Similarly, we developed 8 planning objectives as part of phase 1, and planning objectives are really what are we going to do in this planning process as we engage on this phase 2 effort that's going to, what do we want to accomplish through this planning process? And how are we going to meet those goals? And how is this planning process going to inform that? So here's where, given that we know where we are with supply and demand, here's where we might, instead of shifting what the planning objective is, we might have a different lens as to how we're going to look at that objective. Like if you look at item 1 here, which is examining a comprehensive list of all potential supply projects and management strategies. So we just talked about, we know in the near term that water use efficiency conservation planning is going to be a big ticket near-term item. That's probably going to enter in more heavily now as we look at what is that comprehensive list, and do we have an opportunity to dig a little deeper in areas that we can come up with a unit of conserved supply, which is essentially water that we're not using. And so we know for objective 1, we're probably going to spend more time on conservation than initially we might have thought, 6 months or a year ago. Another area is we wanted to focus in on making sure that we can make near-term tough decisions and document the timing and drivers for future decisions. So that's item 3 here. So as we talk about the timeline for this, a lot of the decisions that you may need to make in the near term might not be as tough as we initially thought they are. Because they're going to be, again, probably pretty conservation focused. But I think what we want to try to do through this effort is what Thomas was saying too, is we do have a runway now. So how do we want to look at how we can prepare for these instances in the future, whether they're drastic climate change impacts? As a board, you've brought up things like, the viability of state water project in the long term, even if it extends well beyond 2050, what do we need to be looking at now? You've now brought up the semi-tropic, how viable is that looking into the future? And so I think one of the aspects that we're going to want to do in item 3 here is really thinking through what do we need to decide now? And what do we need to prepare for you to decide later based on certain triggers and indicators, and how can we create that roadmap so that you have a pathway for making those decisions in the future when it's appropriate. And so that ties into item 4 here, adaptive, dynamic, and feasible implementation pathway. So we're going to be spending probably a good chunk of time thinking about how we can create an implementation pathway that's going to be useful in the near term as well as in the longer term. Then I also want to touch on item 7 here, and even item 6, where we knew another one of the deliverables that we had as part of phase 1 was developing a communication and engagement strategy. That strategy was built upon a lot of the input that we got in phase 1 from the public, from interested parties, of what kinds of things are they wanting to engage on, what are their values, how is it best to work with them through this phase 2 process. And so we developed a plan on how to engage and do public outreach. But so in doing that, we also know that with conservation, that's a huge part of getting the public and the folks that you serve on board with what needs to be done, because they're going to be a huge part in achieving those objectives. So this may be an opportunity for us to use this planning effort in items 6 and 7 there to really look at collaboration with other entities. And also, can we use some of the outreach that we're doing as part of this to start that education process about conservation and what it might take to meet the urban water use objectives. And so there's an opportunity here, since we're going to be doing this already, that we can actually partner and make sure that we're getting those messages forward. And finally here, we have the evaluation criteria that we looked at. And so in reviewing those, a lot of these are still applicable, and we use these, right, to decide, you know, here's a suite of strategies that we might have looking into the future, but how do they perform relative to each other across these different values that we've heard? Again, this list was developed from input from directors, from staff, from interested parties and potential partner agencies, as well as the public themselves. And so when we relook at what these different criteria could be, we did sort of an assessment. Do all of these still make sense given this new condition and this new future assumption on meeting urban water use objectives? And they all do still apply. The difference might be as we get into deciding how important these are relative to each other, that's where we may be able to have more of a nuanced discussion. The good news, we don't need to decide that today. That's going to be much further along in the process when we actually have alternatives to share and we decide how we want to evaluate them and how do we want to make decisions based on them. We can relook at these criteria then and decide how important are they relative to each other. Are there ones that, you know, that are top tier that we've got to do no matter what, or maybe even some of the metrics that we use for determining that we might want to tweak a bit based on what we're seeing and some of the future condition assumptions that we're making. So again, these are the water resources goals, the planning objectives, and then the evaluation criteria. Those are all things that came from phase 2. And I think we're just looking for confirmation from you all tonight that these still seem relevant and make sense, because these are going to be heavily used in our phase 2 process. So we wanted to bring them back up again for you today. And so with that, if there's any clarification questions, I can certainly help with that before I turn it over to Philippe, and he's going to facilitate discussion to get good input and feedback on all of this.
I don't have
Director
any
Akbari?
questions before we go into discussion, but I was hoping maybe.
Favor?
You can always count on Mr. Abreu.
Got my internet working, so now I've got a lot of stuff. Otherwise, I would have no ideas without Google. The Sigma plan problems, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in Kern County. What are they? So here's a list. There's inadequate coordination among the various agencies. There's a chronic lowering of groundwater levels where we're doing all this banking, but the levels are going down. And not just a little bit, they're going down a lot. You can detect them with satellites. And land subsidence, you can detect them with land subsidence too. The land subsidence is a problem. The degradation of water quality with nitrates or whatever in agricultural, the depletion of interconnected surface water, the criteria are poorly coordinated across the subbasins. The wells are 20% of the domestic wells in the basin could go dry based on whatever. So I guess the domestic wells, that would be those little farming villages with people who are scrambling for money to put food on the table. The lowest income people that might get hit by that. And then the infrastructure is with the subsidence there's critical infrastructure that is going to be vulnerable to damage caused by subsidence, like the canals and whatever all that water infrastructure. When there's too much subsidence, is going to get hit. And then there's lack of monitoring in limiting the understanding and management of groundwater quality degradation. So that's a good list.
So to start this discussion, I want Persephone to stay up here. And I just want to go over, because the goals, objective, criteria are kind of the things that drive into this matrix of our demands, our gaps, and our alternatives. So just want to see if there's any comments, questions on these. You've seen these already, but this is your second time through. Are there any kind of clarification comments you want to make on these goals? And we'll go to the criteria. Seeing none, go to the next slide there, Persephone. So in terms of planning objectives, any clarifications or comments on these? Seeing none, go to the next slide. And then these are the evaluation criteria. Are there any clarifications, questions on these?
On this one, I would just be interested as we develop the metrics that we're going to be capturing, but
Yeah, so the metrics that embody these, you'll be interested in evaluating those, seeing those.
Yes, and we will bring those back for sure. I think they're going to be a little bit in flux until we start to see what we're working with, and then we can figure out a recommendation for what we think the best metric might be. It'll be a combination of how do we best get at what we mean by this so that we can differentiate between the alternatives, as well as, you know, usable data source that's actually something that is meaningful and reliable.
Any other comments or questions on the evaluation criteria? None. Okay, next slide then. So the way I want to frame at least the initial part of this discussion, because this is really your time, but I thought we'd frame it in kind of two different ways. The first question is really kind of going to the question of how do we conduct this process over the next 15 months? One of the previous general managers, Paul Pereno, on reflecting on the experience up at Mission San Jose said, you know, we tried to get on the cutting edge of technology and we found ourselves on the bleeding edge. And I think in this case, because of this runway that Thomas referenced, we don't have to be an early adopter. We're not up against the wall where we need to kind of jump at an alternative. So it gives us a lot of runway and opportunity to hold a variety of different options concurrently without being pushed to make the decision. Or to use a different metaphor, our car is running well, you know, with some new tires, it can go another 50,000 miles before we need to think about investing in a new car. So I think that is kind of what we have in terms of runway. And so given that greater runway, are there any kind of shifts from your perspective in terms of emphasis on the process that you think would be good to consider?
I don't have anything to offer other than what we presented or commented on in the last session that we had with you.
Okay.
I would say my focus continues to remain on being able to plan appropriately for both short-term and long-term objectives and to mitigate risk, be it regulatory, environmental, financial. So same comments I'd shared last.
Yeah, so I think we have some near-term regulatory guidance that's going to lead to some more optimization steps, but we still have kind of a horizon. Whenever that horizon is realized, we'll have time to monitor and evaluate how that's developing, what the external factors are, as well as some of these alternatives that you might think like, that's not going to work. It actually gives the potential for them to stay in consideration perhaps a little bit longer. And I think that'll be one of the decisions that you will need to collectively make as we get towards the end of the next 15 months. Director Gunther.
No, we're trying to, you know, address a cloud almost, you know, how do you, things are so changeable.
Mm-hmm.
Just with the loss of Focare, just poof.
Yeah.
Like a month disappeared. Well, the good news is maybe we don't need it because of what we've just done is the exercise, well, other things are coming together. That is now the state says, okay, this is what you're gonna have to do. Thank you. Whether we agree with it or not, anyway, at least we know what it is.
Mhm.
I see that, I think we're going the right way. I'd like to keep going this way. I'm very open because I think we're looking at a very open market.
Yeah.
Or environment. Sea level rise. Okay. Where's it gonna be? Well, there are ranges all over everywhere. It's gonna have an impact. I think the impacts are only half understood, if even that one. Particularly with groundwater. But we're looking at it, so continue.
Right, so I think that's a good point. Like on sea level rise, the fact that we have more runway and time means actually we're going to have more data and be able to better reduce the uncertainty in terms of the projected impacts in 10 years' time.
I mean, we're trying to figure out 2050. If we go back just 25 years,
Mhm.
what we were talking about 25 years, is nothing like what we're looking at tonight.
Yeah.
Can't even remember, I guess we had fish ladders in the thought process because it took 25 years to build them. But, you know, when it takes 25 years to build a fish ladder or 20 years, yeah, we better be looking at 2050.
Right, so there's the external risk like a sea level rise. There's like implementation risk, as you cite relative to Los Vaqueros. There's the kind of scenario risk that you pose in terms of what happens if we lose semi-tropic. What is the likelihood of that? What would the impacts be? What are alternatives for us? But you're going to say another point, Dr. Sethy?
Yeah, and going to the last supplemental slide that you have here, which is about sea level rise.
Can you go to that slide?
Yeah.
This is data that's being well publicized. But if I were talking to a future board and management staff, I think there are two other catastrophic events that we need to take into consideration. One is the seismic risk of what happens in the Delta. And we have really good, like 3D motion films that have now been developed at UC Davis, UC San Diego, that show how quickly seawater would go all the way down to the pumps in Tracy. That it would be, you know, like 7 days, 5 to 7 days. And what I have talked about in our community for a long, long time is that we sit on the most vulnerable fault in the nation, the Hayward Fault. That's according to USGS. It has the greatest chance of having a catastrophic $1 trillion event for the Bay Area. We did not have 1,100 miles of levees in the Delta when the last great earthquake happened in 1868. By the way, before 1906 earthquake, that was called the Great San Francisco Earthquake. It was not called the Hayward earthquake. And if you go back 2,000 years on geology, a major earthquake of 7.0 or greater happens every 90 to 165 years. The average is 140. The maximum is 165. And we are in year 156 right now. We're past the median and we're getting close to the maximum. And so we have to ask ourselves, what happens if for some length of time, we have the inability to bring water in from Northern California through the Delta to our communities? And we're part of Silicon Valley. This is an economic engine for the state. And so there has to be some contingency planning to think about the likelihood of that happening. It will happen.
Yeah, so I think that goes to a discrete event, a discrete catastrophic event, and what does that do to our portfolio? And you guys have been very proactive in investing in your distribution system, looking at seismic strengthening of the backbone. But the fact that you're dependent on these imported sources and the respective vulnerabilities, SFPUC is invested, $4.4 billion on the seismic strengthening, but we still don't know yet how it will shake out, no pun intended, in terms of service and what that means for long-term recovery, as you say, of the Silicon Valley, was the economic
They're
engine.
pretty good studies that say, it may be up to a year before
Right.
we have good quality water coming through the Delta. So this is why I always try to come back to what can we do that provides a reliable supplemental water source within our jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So we serve 3 cities in southern Alameda County, but our jurisdiction really is to protect the Niles Cone aquifer. So our jurisdiction goes, almost close to the Oakland Airport on the west side of 880. And we have it in the notes that you summarized here, regional collaboration. We have an opportunity to at least study putting in a second desalination plant, brackish water desal. And we know where the brine could possibly go. We know where the power sources are for a plant like that. And we potentially have San Francisco, East Bay Mud, City of Hayward, ourselves, as partners in putting something together that would provide some resiliency and reliability for the interior Bay Area. I believe, and we asked this earlier, it's in one of the slides here, where can we take a leadership position?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is one area for leadership. Number 2, when we
Can I just pause and just ask a follow-up question? In that situation, when we come to the water resource planning, there would be an additional value beyond dry year reliability of kind of a supply reliability post-seismic event that would be a value. So there'd be an insurance premium you'd be willing to pay for that additional reliability on this side of the Hayward Fault. Is that kind of basically?
You captured that well.
Okay. Go on to your second point.
So when we went through the huge storms 2 years ago, where we had a lot of flooding, we had a brand new Tulare Lake, for example, right?
Right.
People hadn't seen that in 50 years. But I was circulating out a lot of current academic articles on the potential for catastrophic flooding in California. And the last time that happened was in 1862. And the entire Sacramento Valley was flooded all the way down through the San Joaquin Valley. It took years for the water to dissipate. There were hundreds of thousands of cattle, sheep, goats that were killed. Our governor, Leland Stanford, had to row on a boat for his inauguration in Sacramento. And there are now really good studies on the periodicity of these events that we can trace back through tree rings, geology, other things that show that California has a regular cycle of these superstorm events, and we're not prepared for it. And if you have that kind of flooding coming through the Delta, again, the 1,100 miles of levee is vulnerable. So we don't know what we're going to end up with. And I think those are 2 supplementary things that you need to provide here for future reference: the seismic vulnerability and the catastrophic flooding that could occur.
It's interesting you mentioned that because it really sets up what I think is going to be a significant policy choice for you. Because we actually can say, here's the likelihood of a 7, an 8 on the quake. So we have that. We have it probabilistically as you're recounting the history we're due. We can project some of the damages that would result. And we can talk about, here are some alternatives that we think would be fairly seismic proof, subject to power availability, staffing, and all that kind of stuff. And then we can attach a cost to that. And part of the question will be, there's going to be the avoided damages, but there's also going to be the cost of the insurance. And that's going to be, in some ways, the information you need to make the decision in terms of how much to invest in this insurance. And you have to weigh that up against water rates, rate increases, but the information you need is those three pieces you mentioned. What's the likelihood? What's the consequence? How much is the insurance going to cost me? And then what would that translate to in terms of our CIP, our water
That's
rates?
where I try to emphasize the point that this can be a shared insurance policy for East Bay Mud, Hayward, ACWD, San Francisco, perhaps even Santa Clara.
Mhm.
So this is something that I think we need to explore, and we can't be afraid of the inevitable. But these things are going to happen.
Yeah.
We need to think out through the rest of the century.
And I do think there's a regional leadership aspect of this, which is, I'm working with the Santa Clara Valley Water District right now as they're looking at a potable reuse program that has a price tag in excess of $2 billion. But in the case of a major quake, a major event, you know, all bets of territory, I think, are off. It becomes a situation of like, how do we help each other kind of survive? To that end, it's kind of an interesting question. If there is this insurance benefit you get to facility in San Jose, or a benefit that somebody gets to a facility here in Fremont, then what sort of cost sharing would be appropriate for the insurance value of that in a disaster? It's kind of an interesting thing. It kind of transcends a little bit of our traditional institutional boundaries, but it is something that actually is reasonable, though I imagine the barriers would be not insignificant, which is why it calls for leadership.
I've been sitting here thinking something else has been bugging me, and it's been bugging me for a while. Semi-tropic. There's a lot of negativity about semi-tropic, particularly since Sigma came up. But semi-tropic banking was done before Sigma. And I remember that it was done to fix the problem. And now there's this aura, oh no, the bank's gonna, it's gonna fail, but because groundwater basin and Sigma regulations. Reality is, or at least my reality, and I think some others, is that we shouldn't be looking at this as negative. We should be looking at this as, this is why we do it. This is why we did this, was to prevent what's happening. And now we got to figure out, okay, it seems like it's still going on. Why? We're doing groundwater banking. Are we doing something wrong? Are they doing something wrong? Maybe they are. Maybe they're not living up to their end in Sigma. But should that affect the bank? Because if we destroy the bank, I feel that we're going to make the situation a whole lot worse than where it is. Because I can't remember exactly what year it was. 98 maybe, somewhere in there. We first entered into the semi-tropic.
Earlier than that,
In the like
95, 96, it was
It
right
was-
at.
I was on the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
And went down there. The guys came here and we're kind of all looking at each other, and it was a plan to fix the problem. And they already knew the problem existed. Maybe not to the extent it did. I think it's time that maybe we start taking some leadership as a banking partner and saying, hey, wait a minute. Yes, Sigma, we get it. We got it in 98. That's why we did this. That's why we joined up. It was in 98. We saw the value of joining into this. So please don't kill it. Because people coming in and looking at it from a pure Sigma point of view will say, well, geez, we can't have this water banking. Reality is we started it to prevent what's just happening now.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing as we look at alternatives is this regulatory risk notion. That of course, with the Wanger decision, we were totally surprised to have the pumps turned off and have a regulatory drought. And of course, part of the solution there has been to kind of look at some different hardware configuration. But when you're talking about in terms of groundwater banking, that regulatory changes, you know, it's one of those things where I think your new assistant is going to be monitoring those kind of things that could limit and inhibit the ability to operate with
The
intended.
major decision should be the same one that we
Yeah.
use for the Delta conveyance.
Right.
In that, oh, we're gonna send more water down south. Well, I remember when a judge shut the pumps off,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason that was, it didn't necessarily have to, there were issues other than sending it south. But still, a judge had the ability to shut the pumps off.
Yeah.
And still does.
Right, and that again brings back to this question about locally controlled, independent. What value is that versus your investment in being involved in the regulatory process that govern the operations?
Pretty
And it's,
valuable.
Yeah,
I
it's a
don't
both and.
disagree with Director Gunther. I always thought it was a good idea for ACWD to be involved with water banking down in Kern County. And it looked beneficial and good 30 years ago. It still may be viable, but what you see happening with the State Water Control Board on how they're coming down on all the communities in Fresno, Tulare, and Kings County, Kern County, there's just too much subsidence going on,
Mhm.
and you're seeing a changing environment, you know, as to what the benefits are. And we have other water districts that bank at semi-tropic too, that have the same concerns right now.
Mhm.
You know, I'm not raising this just out of the blue independently. We have quite a few other agencies that are wondering about the viability of semi-tropic. So it's a great thing that we're doing right now. It's been beneficial for our customers, but we have to be prepared with some contingency plans in case that goes away. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that's the environment we live in that is changing. And how do we stay on top of that? And how are we proactive in sort of forming and shaping some of those changes? But I think for this process, what's important is we need to characterize the risks that are not only infrastructure risk, but they're operational regulatory risk. They're kind of institutional partnership risk and opportunities.
And our contract goes to 2034, which is
Right.
when you see that we're gonna need that extra supply.
Yeah.
So,
Which is actually why I agree with Director Sethy.
Mhm.
Local, we can control somewhat what we do here. Somewhat.
Yeah.
Regulatory requirements here are like my opinion, they're the elephant in the room.
Mhm.
We kind of know what sea level's gonna do. Kind of know drought. He brought those papers about the flood before the floods.
Mhm.
I mean, talk about.
yeah, a year before the
The year
floods
before the
happened.
floods, he's talking about this massive flood, Tulare Lake and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden, there it was.
Yes.
So.
It's kind of fun when you do that, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
I had a client call me up, the director of a capital program, and I'd gone through a risk analysis with them before they implemented this largest capital program they'd ever done. And we did this risk analysis in 2018, 2019. He called me up, he says, I was just re-looking at that risk analysis, and number 2 on your list was pandemic. He says, called that one, you know.
You know,
We didn't call that one.
if I might make another prediction, and I was thinking about this after going through the presentation, what we're really doing, and I know that Mr. Nizar felt this when he worked on the last IRP, is that we're really writing a letter to the future, to our future compatriots that will be running this district.
Mhm.
And so I can make one prediction. It won't be the same board or the same staff, but they will be reading what we produce today.
Mhm.
It's a letter to the future.
And that's my second question I have for you. And that letter to the future, because if we're talking about how we do these next 15 months, the question is, at the end of these 15 months, what is our leave behind? And what in there will be valuable for somebody picking up this report 10 and 20 years later? What are the things that if you're writing, as I talked with Ms. Heides before the meeting, if you're writing that letter that the outgoing presidents put in the desk for the predecessor, what would you want that next board of the future, staff of the future to know? What needs to be captured as we go through this process? What needs to be transparent to them? So you started
I'd
it.
like to collect on that bet in 2035.
I think one of the things we should do is say, be proactive. The staff here has been proactive. They've always been out looking. They've never sat on their hands and said, oh, we're good. Plenty of supply. Delta's fine. Alameda Creek's fine. Also one day, here comes a steelhead. What's that? These guys have been on it. I think it's very important future, understand it's important to have a staff that is on it. It's not afraid to be on it. We made a mistake up on mission, okay, fine, we made a mistake. But, we were trying. What we were trying wasn't exactly something, I heard at an aqua conference preaching how wonderful it was gonna be by a general manager from another district, a big one. This is the solution. I'm sitting in the back of the room going, you heard of, do you know what's happening in our plant? But hopefully, message to the future staffs is look back to what the staffs have done today. Not just the board, but we as a district, we've always been out there. And we've been one of the forerunners. Director Sethy sitting on the finance committee with the Delta conveyance. We're in the game. We're in the room. We've been leaders there. We need to stay being. We can't back away.
I wonder if you would agree that staff and the board has been both proactive and also opportunistic. And I think of opportunistic in the ways you've gotten funding, grants, the way you kind of made a decision here, 7 years ago in the low interest environment to try to accelerate your CIP because the interest rates were favorable. So I wonder if that would be a fair statement.
I think so.
So what other things we need to document somehow in this process so that it would be transparent to people, some of the issues that were pivot points for our recommendations or lack of recommendations? Is there any thoughts you have along those lines?
So kind of building on what Director Gunther was sharing, I think sometimes what I think would be helpful to a future board is the decision criteria and kind of the framework for how we made decisions. I think if we're, if they're evaluating a new source of supply, it's a little bit less helpful to understand the conclusion we came to. It's more helpful to understand why we came to that conclusion. And so the previous 3 slides on the evaluation criteria, goals, and objectives, I think leaving those behind for a future board would be really critical for them to understand why particular decisions were made and what objectives and metrics we were driving towards. The other thing for a future board that, again, kind of going back to risk, if they're evaluating a new source of supply, I think it's important to kind of contextualize it and say, well, what are the existing risks? What are the risks to the existing sources of supply, and how do the new sources of supply mitigate against those risks? At least that's kind of one of the ways that I think about it. And so those are the 2 big things that I would want well documented so that a future board can better understand our decision-making process.
Yeah, I think those are great points. On the second point, it seems like this notion when it comes to risks that there's known risk and there's kind of known unknown risks. And I think documenting what we saw at this point in time would help them to see what we maybe didn't see at this point in time.
Well, it's not just us. It's our consultants. too.
Yeah, no, it's us. I'm saying the collective we
That's
is
what
us.
we're paid for.
Yeah.
Um, Do we have any comments from Director Wong?
We do. Um, and I've got editorial comments for a few things I heard, but I'll share those later. I want to step back to question number one, the shifts in emphasis. Director Wong specifically noted she sees a greater importance on local supply and new storage, specifically storage that we feel is reliable and available in droughts. Also noting operational flexibility, the ability to move supplies around mostly on the off-site. So how we get the supplies to us. I think that's largely talking about perhaps delta constraints. And then again, investments in conservation. And emphasizing the need to have a staggered ramping up of our conservation approach. As we said, this is a big new challenge we have. And when we put that portfolio together to see that it's staggered, that we are, taking the easier steps first. But she did say greater conservation in the near term. So emphasizing the importance of getting money going. Under question 2 for the board of the future, I'm paraphrasing. ACWD will only build projects for customers' benefits that are based on demonstrated needs, that there's a plan in place and a roadmap, that the plan was thoughtful, and also that the plan is adaptive. She put it, will not be irrelevant within 10 years, that the plan's adaptive in the face of potential major change. And I paraphrase that as terminology we've been using as a framework to lay out how difficult decision-making will be done. Similar to what Director Akbari was saying, actually.
I would like to go back to the beginning of your presentation where we were talking about $5 million a year in conservation efforts. So I'm not afraid of that dollar amount. And I have brought up here before, I know we were looking into it with our assemblyman before started seeing budget deficits at the state level. But the current process for turf replacement is so cumbersome. It's ridiculous what people have to go through to replace a lawn with drought tolerant gardening. And the application process is burdening. The interview with the district is, has to be scheduled before they do anything. So I have proposed that at the state level, they need to authorize money for direct installs of water tolerant gardens and stuff. And if the state doesn't do it, we have the money to do it ourselves. So we should come up with our own program to, person calls up, they say, I want my lawn replaced. We've got the vendors that are ready. We have their choices of landscaping that they can select from. And we give them, we pay for having it replaced ourselves. We have to take the initiative to be much more proactive in that area of conservation. We can do a lot more.
One of the broader issues, and I wonder, Mr. Stevenson, how this kind of impacts your own kind of thinking about budgeting, because it seems like there were going to be kind of soft cost and hard cost emerging from this. As we talk about being proactive on the regulatory front and the monitoring and evaluation that needs to be part of those would be kind of soft cost things. I don't know where the conservation program, if that was accelerated, would that also be? So it becomes a question in terms of how you want to capture that. It would be good for you to think about that. So as we think about this project, it's easily to slot into those categories.
Yeah, and we know that we're going to pay some of those costs regardless, right? So we're talking about different pathways, but we know we have to achieve certain levels of conservation. So we're going to have to pay those costs. It's going to be really key as to which paths we choose and specifically how we try and address this on what time frame and based upon what triggers that'll impact what our costs look like, in the future. So I think that'll be really important to evaluate as we go through this.
I don't want to get too much down into the weeds here, but let me just suggest some numbers. We offer up to $2 a square foot for 1,500 square feet for residential customers. It's different for CAI. So that's $3,000. You want to convert 1,000 lawns a year in the community? Well, it's $3 million, no? And we have to factor in the cost of contractors, the landscape architects, other things too. So, you know, I've worked out the numbers. It's about $5 million a year. But it's
Your budget's all taken up, Thomas.
it's achievable.
But I think that's kind of a great example of like, where do we put our eggs in what basket, right? And I'll channel my inner Director Huang too, because this was some input. She's in agreement with you with regard to direct install as a tool. Really though, focusing on the indoor sort of demand reduction, like fixtures, and Thomas mentioned toilets and so forth and so on, where, hey, the unit cost of that work and the dollars per acre foot of reduced demand are pretty high relative to some of the programs that the lower hanging fruit that we've implemented to date. However, we know we're going to have to achieve those higher levels of indoor demand reduction. And so when Director Huang was contemplating the first question here, she was really thinking, okay, we got to put our sort of emphasis on achieving the demand reductions that we have to achieve anyway, but what are the best ways to do that? And in her mind, she feels that direct install and some other things like that are going to be necessary. But really, what is the timeline for implementing certain things over time? Just also incidentally, and Mr. Neiser mentioned it, but I think when she was thinking about the first question too, in terms of kind of the supply side, I think she was looking at it from the standpoint of recognize that we've got more flexibility now because we're not faced with the same outlook that we were faced with in 1995. And now we have some flexibility. So it's really, where do we emphasize our next steps based upon that flexibility that we have? She was thinking a lot of what I heard amongst the three of the members of the board that are here tonight in terms of those uncertainties in the future, uncertainties in the Delta, uncertainties with regard to imported supplies in general. That's, I think, what resulted in her comments about, thinking, emphasizing on local control and local storage. So I think just wanted to add that additional flavors for sort of some of Director Huang's comments. But yeah, so her comments have been very much in alignment with much of what I heard here this evening so far.
Any other remarks there, Mr. Neiser?
From Director Wong, but I did want to make one editorial comment. So district, we got involved in semi-tropic pretty early. I was first here in '97 and I was already modeling and working on the recommendation for the expansion. But I think the allegory here is that in '97, this board was very concerned that it wouldn't work. I think there was an overwhelming sentiment that Metropolitan Water District would never allow the water to be pumped into the aqueduct. We worked on assumptions that in a critical drought that semi-tropic just wouldn't be available, but it would be available in modest droughts. So these concerns about it not working were very real. It was the first groundwater bank in the state of California, right? We were part of blazing new territory here. But I think it's good context for this. What's going to go wrong? What won't work? We talk about Wanger. We talk about Delta failures. The one thing is I like to bring up sort of the black swan concern. These things don't just happen in a vacuum. There's responses. People know how to handle them. And we also need to keep that context in mind.
You know, I have actually been there once.
Semi-tropic.
Yeah. And so it's like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Yes.
It was a really good field trip to be on to see that, and plus another nearby water bank too.
Speaking of black swans, this is the first time I've seen Halloween decorations, all black swans in the person's yard, like 100 of them.
It wasn't Ben Bernanke, was it?
No.
Okay.
Any other comments before we close out here? Well, thank you for your engagement, your time. I'm reminded of the quotation attributed to Niels Bohr, the nuclear physicist, who said, "Prediction is difficult, especially of the future." So good luck to us all.
That sounds like a Casey Stengel quote,
Or Yogi Berra.
or Yogi Berra.
That's a Yogi Berra.
Okay, so we're slowly wrapping it up. Yeah, if Mr. Abreu, you have any more comments for tonight?
Oh, actually, sorry, we did have just a couple wrap-up slides, just to hit the next steps. I'll just give them if that's okay. Main thing was to lay out for the board, you already saw this in your packets, we do have 4 more workshops specific to this project, with a little bit of extra detail about what to expect in there. I think those dates have been set, and can be shared in the very near future. And that was really it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone.
But if there's any comments or observations by our members of the public, we're definitely interested in those. And again, we don't have members of the public online right now.
Our guests may want to hold on just a bit for my director's report on the Delta conveyance.
Okay. All right. Well, appreciate the work. Keep your sleeves rolled up. We're going to keep at it. Okay, so I do have a couple brief general managers reports this evening. First one has to do with a new program we're about to roll out for our customers. I wanted to give you all a heads up about it, and I'll let Ms. Heides share the news.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. So the Water Saving Center, which is a new online portal for water use efficiency program application processing and tracking, which was previewed with the Water Resources and Conservation Committee in July, is now ready to go live. So we're excited that on Monday, the ACWD website and the AMI customer portal Ways to Save module that you find on there will be updated to direct customers to the Water Saving Center if they want to apply for our programs. Also, a Tri-City Voice ad announcing the Water Saving Center is planned to go out next week as well. So as customers visit our website or contact us to inquire about rebate programs, they will be directed to the new Water Saving Center. We'll send the board a link to the new center when it goes live next week in case you'd like to explore it yourselves. That concludes my report.
So we're getting a head start on all that conservation. Okay, next up, I think you might, moving around the campus here, you might have noticed some things look a little bit different right now. It's because there's an awful lot of activity happening here, but there's also activity happening in other district facilities related to our clean energy program. And I'll let Mr. Awoke share what's happening.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. Good evening, board members, staff, and the public. Yes, I do like to share some good news. So we've made progress on the clean energy project. And as Mr. Stevenson alluded to, you may have seen some limited parking on site, and that's because we have started relocating materials and district vehicles to make way for the clean energy project, solar installations happening at the headquarters campus. The work is expected to begin within the next few weeks, and we are waiting for confirmation in the building permit for the contractor to pull the building permit for the headquarters solar energy project. But that's good news. We're making progress. You'll see a lot of activity, especially in the courtyard area. And the impact, in order to mitigate the impact, the employee parking impact, we have worked with the Fremont Unified School District across the street, and they've been kind enough to allow parking at their site. We're also working with the property owner adjacent to the headquarters campus, and we are finalizing those agreements with the adjacent property owner to provide additional parking in the event that's needed. In addition to that, I'm also happy to report that solar installation work at the Mayhew Reservoir and the Newark Desalination Facility are expected to begin on or about November 4th. The project team is preparing notices and letters to be sent to adjacent property owners that may be impacted by construction activity, especially on the Mayhew Reservoir project. So I just wanted to give the board a heads up on that. But if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to respond.
Okay, that completes our general manager's reports for the evening.
I have one director's report. Last Thursday was the meeting of the Delta Conveyance Finance Authority up in Sacramento. And we met for 3 hours. It was a very good session, and what I particularly wanted to call out, aside from routine things that we had to take action on, one was we had a really good update from the executive director, Graham Bradner, who's presented to our board before, on an update on everything that's going on with the Delta Conveyance project. I have provided that presentation to Mr. Stevenson for distribution to our board. So I would invite you to take a look at that. And then number two, we were provided with the presentation that was given by the Metropolitan staff to their board on October 7th, looking at the different funding scenarios for their participation in the Delta Conveyance system. Their support is critical because it's nearly half of the project funding. And we really need to understand what level of funding they're willing to move forward on over the next 3 years, especially the 2 years that's in their current budget cycle. So that presentation was sent out before this board meeting. I hope you take a look at that. And the indication was that we should have a decision by the Met board in December, if not then January. So we are planning on reconvening for our next meeting, probably January at the latest February. Other than that, no further update.
Okay. Well, we do have a closed session on this agenda for this evening. I think that's still on.
Still on.
That, things moving.
Yes, I'm happy to take us into closed session. It's now 6:04. We're just going to convene into closed session pursuant to California Government Code Section 54956.9 subsection D2, conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation, one potential case. We can now convene into closed session.
Hey, the time is 6:53 and the board is back in session. I'll turn to the legal counsel to read out.
Yes, the board met in closed session for item 8.1 pursuant to California Government Code Section 54956.9 subsection D2. Conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation, one potential case, and no action was taken in the closed session, and that concludes the open session report.
Thank you for that. And with that, I will declare the meeting over.
Everybody.